The leather reins slipped through Eleanor Vance's fingers like water as the chestnut mare beneath her lunged forward with a wild scream. And in that terrible moment, she knew she was going to die on this Montana road with the summer sun blazing overhead and nobody to remember her name, except the banker back in St. Louis, who held the deed to her father's failed dry goods store. The mare had been skittish from the moment. Eleanor purchased her at the livery in Helena 3 hours ago, but the stable master had assured her the animal was sound, just spirited. And Eleanor had believed him because she needed to believe something good could happen after 6 months of watching her father drink himself into an early grave, and her mother follow him there from heartbreak. The horse had seemed calm enough as they left the bustling streets of Helena behind. Heading east toward the small ranch Eleanor had inherited from an aunt she barely remembered, a final desperate chance at a life that did not involve serving drinks to minors or worse. Then a rattlesnake had appeared in the middle of the rutted road, coiled and buzzing its warning, and the mare had reared with such violence that Eleanor nearly lost her seat entirely. She had grabbed for the saddle horn with one hand while trying to maintain control of the reins with the other, but the leather was old and her palms were already slick with sweat from the August heat. And when the mare came down running faster than Eleanor had ever moved in her 22 years of careful city living, the reins simply slid away. The road stretched ahead like a brown ribbon through golden grassland that rolled toward distant mountains, and the mare was heading straight down it at a pace that made the world blur on either side. Eleanor clung to the saddle horn with both hands now, her body bouncing painfully against the hard leather, her spine jarring with each thundering hoofbeat. The mare's neck was stretched forward, ears pinned back, running blind in her panic. Eleanor tried to speak, tried to call out a soothing word, but the wind stole her breath and all she could manage was a strangled cry that meant nothing to the terrified animal beneath her. She was dimly aware of the sound of other hoofbeats behind her, gaining fast, but she did not dare turn her head to look. Her entire world had narrowed to staying on this horse, to not falling under those pounding hooves or being thrown into the rocks that lined the roadside. Her bonnet had blown off somewhere back there, and her dark hair was coming loose from its pins, whipping across her face and into her mouth. She tasted dust and fear. The other horse pulled alongside on the left, close enough that Eleanor could hear the snorting breaths of both mount and rider. She risked a glance and saw a man bent low over the neck of a powerful black stallion, his face set in fierce concentration beneath the brim of a worn brown hat. He was young, maybe 25, with several days' worth of dark stubble on his jaw and eyes the color of smoke in winter. He looked at her for just a second, and she saw something in his expression that was not pity but understanding, as if he knew exactly what it felt like to lose control of something precious and be carried away by forces you could not master. "Hold on," he shouted, and his voice was rough from trail dust but steady, the kind of voice that knew how to gentle horses and probably people too. He urged his stallion closer, so close their legs were almost touching, and reached out toward the mare's bridle. The first time he missed, his fingers brushing the leather but unable to catch hold. The mare swerved away from him instinctively, and Eleanor felt her grip on the saddle horn slipping. Her arms were burning with the effort of holding on, and she could feel bruises forming along her inner thighs where they gripped the saddle. The cowboy did not hesitate. He urged his horse forward again, matching the mare's pace exactly, and this time when he reached out his hand closed around the bridle near the bit. The mare tossed her head, fighting him, but he held firm and began to pull back, slowing his own horse at the same time. Eleanor could see the muscles in his arm straining against his shirt sleeve, the cord standing out in his neck, "Easy now," he said, and Eleanor was not sure if he was talking to her or the horse or both of them. "Easy, girl. Nobody is going to hurt you." The mare fought for another few seconds, but something in his voice or his touch seemed to reach through her panic. She began to slow, her gait shifting from a flat-out run to a canter, then a rough trot. The cowboy kept talking to her in that low, steady voice, and gradually the mare came to a walk and then finally stopped, her sides heaving, foam flecking her neck and chest. Eleanor sat frozen in the saddle, her hands still locked around the horn in a death grip. She could not seem to make her fingers uncurl. Her whole body was shaking so hard she thought she might fall off anyway, now that the danger had passed, and there was nothing to focus on except the fact that she had nearly died. The cowboy swung down from his horse in one fluid motion and came to stand beside the mare, one hand still on the bridle, the other reaching up toward Eleanor. "You can let go now," he said gently. "You are safe." She looked down at him and found she could not speak. Her throat was closed tight with unshed tears, and the residual terror that was only now catching up with her. She managed to shake her head, not in refusal but in simple inability to comply. He seemed to understand. He moved closer and reached up with both hands, placing them carefully on her waist. "I am going to help you down," he said. "Is that all right?" She nodded, and he lifted her as easily as if she weighed nothing at all, setting her feet gently on the ground. Her legs immediately buckled, and he caught her before she could fall, one arm around her back and the other supporting her elbow. He smelled like leather and sage and honest sweat, and Eleanor found herself leaning into him without meaning to, her forehead pressing against his chest while her body finally gave in to the shaking. "It is all right," he said again, and his free hand came up to rest lightly on her back. "You are all right now. Just breathe." She tried to follow his instruction, drawing in great gulping breaths of the hot prairie air, and gradually her heart began to slow from its frantic galloping. She became aware that she was clinging to a complete stranger in the middle of an empty road with her hair in wild disarray, and her dress covered in dust and horse sweat. And she pushed back from him abruptly, though her legs still felt unsteady. "I apologize," she managed, her voice coming out thin and shaky. "I do not usually fall apart like that." He stepped back to give her space but stayed close enough to catch her if she stumbled again. "You just had a runaway horse and stayed in the saddle the whole time. That is more than most folks could manage." He reached up to touch the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been a salute or just an acknowledgement. "Xavier Nolan. I run cattle about 10 miles north of here." "Eleanor Vance," she said, and then because she felt she owed him more than just a name after he had saved her life, she added, "I was heading to my aunt's ranch. She passed last spring and left it to me. I did not even know I had an aunt until the lawyer's letter arrived." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition or perhaps concern. "Your aunt would be Martha Vance then, the little spread over by Cottonwood Creek. You knew her." Everyone knew Martha. She was a good woman, kept to herself mostly but never turned away anyone who needed help. He paused, then added carefully, "The ranch has been sitting empty since she died. It will need some work." Eleanor felt her stomach sink. She had known it would not be easy, but the way he said it suggested the situation might be worse than she had imagined. "I see. Well, I do not have much choice. I have nowhere else to go." He studied her for a moment, those winter smoke eyes taking in her city dress and her soft hands and probably every other sign that screamed she did not belong in this hard country. But when he spoke, there was no judgment in his voice. "The mare has calmed down some. If you want, I can lead her while you ride my horse back to Helena. You could get a wagon, hire some men to go with you." "I cannot afford to hire anyone," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. "I used the last of my money for supplies and the horse. I have to make this work." He was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him thinking something through, weighing options she could not guess at. Finally, he said, "I was heading into Helena for supplies anyway. How about I ride along with you to your aunt's place? Make sure you get there safe." "It is not too far out of my way." Pride made her want to refuse, but practicality was stronger. She had already proven she could not handle this alone, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. "I would be grateful," she said quietly. "Thank you." He helped her back into the mare's saddle, checking the girth strap and adjusting the stirrups while he was at it. And she noticed his hands were scarred from years of hard work, but moved with surprising gentleness. When he was satisfied the saddle was secure, he gathered the reins and handed them to her, but he kept his own horse close on the mare's other side, a steady presence that seemed to help the animal stay calm. They rode in silence for a while, following the road as it curved through the grassland. The sun was past its peak now, beginning its long slide toward the western mountains, and the light turned everything golden. Eleanor could hear insects buzzing in the tall grass and the cry of a hawk somewhere high overhead. It was so different from St. Louis, from the crowded streets and the constant noise of the city. Out here the silence felt huge, almost overwhelming, but there was something peaceful about it too. "What made you decide to come out here?" Xavier asked after a while, and the question was casual, but Eleanor sensed genuine curiosity behind it. "I told you, I inherited the ranch." "That is not what I meant. You could have sold it without ever seeing it. Plenty of folks would do that." She considered how much to tell him, this stranger who had saved her life but whom she would probably never see again after today. But something about the openness of the landscape made her want to be honest. "My father died 6 months ago. He had debts I did not know about, and they took everything to settle them. My mother followed him a month later. The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I think she just did not want to stay in a world without him." She paused, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. She had not been able to talk about this with anyone back in St. Louis. When the lawyer's letter came about the ranch, it felt like providence. A chance to start over somewhere nobody knew me or my failures. "Sounds like your parents' failures, not yours." I should have known. Should have paid more attention. Maybe I could have stopped him before things got so bad. Xavier made a soft sound that might have been disagreement. "My father drank himself to death when I was 16, he said, looking straight ahead at the road. "I tried everything I could think of to make him stop. Hid the bottles, poured them out, begged him. None of it made a difference. Eventually I realized he had to want to stop, and he did not. That was not my fault, and what happened to your father was not yours either." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of guilt she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. "Did you run cattle with your father?" "For a while. After he died, I worked for other ranchers until I had saved enough to buy my own land. That was 3 years ago. It is not much yet, but it is mine." There was quiet pride in his voice, the kind that came from building something with your own hands and making it work against all odds. Eleanor found herself wanting to know more about him, this cowboy who spoke of loss without self-pity and who had risked his own safety to save a stranger. But before she could ask anything else, he pointed ahead to where a cluster of cottonwood trees marked a break in the endless grassland. "That is Cottonwood Creek. Your aunt's place is just up past those trees." Eleanor felt her nervousness return. What if the ranch was in ruins? What if there was no house at all anymore, just foundations and broken dreams? But when they rode past the cottonwoods and she saw the small cabin sitting in a clearing near the creek, relief flooded through her. The cabin was small and weathered, but it looked solid. There was a barn behind it that was leaning slightly to one side, and a corral with broken fencing, but these were problems that could be fixed. Xavier helped her dismount again, and this time her legs held steady. She stood looking at the cabin while he tied both horses to the corral railing, and she felt a strange mixture of hope and fear. This was her chance, her one shot at making a life for herself, and she could not afford to fail. "Let me check inside first," Xavier said, and before she could ask why, he added, "Empty buildings attract all kinds of creatures. Better to make sure nothing has moved in." He pushed open the door, which was not locked, and disappeared inside. Eleanor heard him moving around, and then he appeared in the doorway. "Clear. You want to come see?" The inside of the cabin was dim and dusty, but it was larger than she had expected. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a smaller room off to the side that must have been the bedroom, and a lean-to kitchen attached to the back. The furniture was simple but looked sturdy: a table and 2 chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, a narrow bed in the bedroom. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and there were mouse droppings in the corners, but Eleanor had seen worse. She had cleaned up after her father more times than she wanted to remember. "It needs work," Xavier said, echoing his earlier assessment, "but the bones are good. Roof looks sound, and the fireplace draws well. You will want to check the chimney before you light a fire, though. Make sure nothing has nested up there." Eleanor walked slowly through the cabin, running her finger along the dusty table, peering into the fireplace, opening the single window to let in some fresh air. She could do this. It would take time and effort, but she could make this place livable. She could build a life here. She turned to find Xavier watching her from the doorway, and she realized he had been standing there the whole time, probably ready to catch her if she collapsed in despair at the state of things. The thought made her smile despite everything. "It is not so bad," she said. "I have cleaned worse." Something that might have been approval crossed his face. "You need water. I will check the pump." He went back outside, and Eleanor followed him around to the side of the cabin where an old hand pump stood over a stone trough. He worked the handle several times, and after a few dry coughs, the pump produced a stream of rust-colored water that gradually ran clearer. He let it run for a while, then cupped his hand under the flow and tasted it. "Good water," he said. "You will want to clean out the trough, but the well is sound." Eleanor felt another small knot of anxiety loosen. Water meant she could stay. Water meant life. The sun was getting lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Xavier glanced at it with obvious calculation. "It is getting late. I should head back." Eleanor felt a sudden surge of panic at the thought of being left alone out here with night coming on, but she pushed it down. She was going to be alone eventually. She might as well get used to it. "Of course. Thank you for everything. I do not know what would have happened if you had not been there." "You would have figured it out," he said, but his tone was kind. He untied his horse and swung into the saddle, then sat there for a moment looking down at her. "Helena is about 3 hours that way," he said, pointing west. "My place is 2 hours north if you follow the creek until it branches, then take the left fork. If you need anything, you can find me there." "I am sure I will be fine," Eleanor said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. He touched his hat brim again in that same gesture, but he did not move. Finally he said, "This is hard country for anyone, and harder for someone alone. There is no shame in asking for help if you need it." Before she could respond, he had turned his horse and was riding away, the black stallion moving at an easy lope that covered ground faster than it looked. Eleanor watched until he disappeared beyond the cottonwoods, and then she was truly alone. The silence felt even bigger now. She turned back to the cabin and forced herself to start making practical decisions. She needed to unload her supplies from the mare, though there were not many. She needed to sweep out the cabin before it got too dark to see. She needed to check the barn and see if there was any feed for the horse. She needed to not think about the fact that the sun was setting, and she would spend her first night in Montana in a strange cabin with no neighbors for miles. She was halfway through sweeping the main room when she heard a sound outside that made her freeze. It was a coughing bark, harsh and close, and it was followed by another and then another. Coyotes, she thought, or maybe wolves. She did not actually know if there were wolves in Montana, and she realized there were 100 things she did not know about this place, dangerous things. She set the broom aside and went to close the door, dropping the wooden bar across it. The windows had shutters on the inside, and she closed those too, plunging the cabin into darkness. Then she sat down in the rocking chair and waited for morning, too afraid to light a lamp in case it attracted attention, too tired to do anything but sit there and listen to the wild sounds of a country she did not understand. She must have dozed eventually because she woke to sunlight streaming through the cracks in the shutters and her neck aching from the awkward angle of her head. She stood up slowly, her whole body stiff and sore from the previous day's ride and the night in the chair. When she opened the door, the morning was already warm, promising another hot day. The coyotes, or whatever they had been, were gone, and everything looked peaceful and ordinary in the morning light. She spent the day cleaning, hauling water from the pump to scrub the floor and the table and the window. She found a bucket in the barn and used it to water the mare, whom she had tied in the corral the night before. The barn yielded other treasures: a scythe with a broken handle, several oil lamps with a little fuel still in them, a coil of rope that was half rotted but might be salvaged, and a trunk full of her aunt's belongings that she did not have the courage to open yet. By evening she had made the cabin livable if not comfortable. She had found a tin of beans in her supplies and ate them cold because she was still nervous about lighting a fire. As darkness fell again, she barred the door and shutters and sat in the rocking chair, and she told herself that tomorrow would be easier. Tomorrow she would be less afraid. But when tomorrow came, it brought new problems. The mare had broken through a section of the already damaged corral fence during the night and was grazing half a mile away, and it took Eleanor 2 hours to catch her and lead her back. The pump handle broke off in her hand, leaving her with no easy way to get water until she figured out how to fix it. And when she went to the barn to look for tools, she disturbed a rattlesnake that had coiled up in the corner, and she ran back to the cabin with her heart pounding and the snake's buzzing warning still echoing in her ears. She sat on the cabin steps with her head in her hands and let herself cry for the first time since her mother had died. This was impossible. She was going to fail, and then what? She had no money to go back to St. Louis even if she wanted to, which she did not. She had nothing and nowhere and no one. She was still sitting there when she heard hoofbeats approaching, and she looked up to see Xavier riding toward her on his black stallion. He had a pack horse behind him loaded with supplies, and when he saw her face he pulled up short. "What happened?" he asked, dismounting quickly. She tried to wipe her face, but new tears kept coming. "The pump broke. The horse got out. There is a rattlesnake in the barn. I do not know what I am doing. I am going to die out here." He stood there looking at her for a moment, and she waited for him to tell her she should go back to the city where she belonged. Instead, he sat down on the step beside her, keeping a respectful distance but close enough that she could feel his presence. "The pump just needs a new handle, and I brought one. We will get the fence repaired so the horse stays put. The snake will move on if we leave it alone, or I can kill it if you prefer. You are not going to die out here." He paused, then added quietly, "But you also do not have to do this alone if you do not want to." She looked at him through her tears. "You said you were going to Helena for supplies." "I went yesterday after I left here. Then I came back this way to check on you." He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands, not quite meeting her eyes. "I figured you might need some help getting settled." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she intended. "You do not know me. Why would you care what happens to me?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was careful, as if he was trying to find the right words. "When I first started my ranch, I was alone. I did not have family left, and I was too proud to ask for help from neighbors. I nearly lost everything that first winter, because I was trying to do it all by myself. An old rancher named Tom Carlisle finally rode out to my place and told me I was being a fool. He spent a week helping me shore up my fences and get my cattle to sheltered ground, and he did not ask for anything in return. He just said that is what you do out here. You help people because someday you might be the one who needs helping. So this is just you paying forward a debt. No." He finally looked at her directly, and there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "It is more than that. When I saw you on that runaway horse yesterday, fighting so hard to hold on, I saw someone who does not give up even when things are terrifying. And when you said you were staying here despite everything, I saw someone with the kind of courage it takes to make it in this country. I want to help you because I think you are worth helping." Eleanor felt fresh tears spring to her eyes, but they were different now. "I do not know how to repay you. I am not asking for payment. I am asking if you want help." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and he stood up and offered her his hand. When she took it, he pulled her to her feet, and for a moment they stood there with her hand in his, and Eleanor felt something shift in the air between them, something warm and uncertain and full of possibility. Then he let go and went to get the new pump handle from his pack, and the moment passed, but the warmth remained over the next week. Xavier came by every day. He repaired the pump and fixed the corral fence and killed the rattlesnake, which turned out to be a small one despite the terror it had inspired. He showed her how to check the barn for dangers before going in, how to gentle the nervous mare with patient consistency, how to read the sky for weather and the grass for the tracks of animals passing through. He brought supplies from his own stores, a sack of flour, coffee, salt pork, things she would need to survive until she could get to Helena and back with her own purchases. And slowly, without Eleanor quite noticing when it happened, they began to talk. Not just about practical matters, though there were plenty of those, but about everything else. He told her about growing up on a failing ranch with an alcoholic father and a mother who had left when he was 6, about the years of working for other men and saving every penny, about the day he had signed the deed to his own land and felt for the first time like his life belonged to him. She told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about her father's slow decline and her mother's quiet desperation, about the feeling of everything falling apart around her while she tried desperately to hold it together. They talked while they worked, while they ate simple meals at the old table, while they sat on the cabin steps in the evening watching the sun set over the mountains. And somewhere in all that talking, Eleanor began to realize that she looked forward to the sound of his horse approaching, that she missed him when he left, that she had started thinking of him not as Xavier, the helpful neighbor, but as Xavier who made her laugh with his dry observations about the local ranchers, Xavier whose hands were gentle with skittish horses and broken women, Xavier who looked at her sometimes like she was something precious. One evening, after they had finished repairing a hole in the barn roof and were sitting outside watching the stars come out, he said, "You have been here 2 weeks now. You have not been to Helena yet to get proper supplies or let anyone know you are here. I know. I keep meaning to go, but there is always so much to do here. Or maybe you are nervous about going alone." She glanced at him and found him watching her with that steady gaze that seemed to see through all her defenses. "Maybe," she admitted, "I could take you. We could go tomorrow, get you properly set up. You need winter supplies anyway. It is still August, but Montana winter comes fast, and you will want to be ready." The thought of spending a whole day with him, of riding to Helena together like they were something more than just neighbors, made her heart beat faster. "I would like that," she said quietly. They left at dawn the next morning, riding side by side on the road she had first traveled in terror. The mare was calmer now, responding to Eleanor's steady hand on the reins, and Eleanor herself felt different too. Stronger, more certain. The wild country that had seemed so alien and threatening 2 weeks ago now felt almost familiar. And when a hawk cried overhead, she looked up to watch it circle instead of flinching at the sound. Helena was bustling with miners and ranchers and freight wagons hauling supplies. Eleanor had never seen a town quite like it, rough and raw and vibrantly alive. Xavier guided her through the chaos to a general store where he seemed to be well known, and the shopkeeper, a round man with spectacles and a kind smile, greeted him warmly. "Xavier, good to see you. And who is this?" "This is Eleanor Vance. She is Martha's niece, taking over the ranch at Cottonwood Creek." The shopkeeper's face lit up with recognition and sympathy. "Martha was a fine woman. I am sorry for your loss, Miss Vance. Let me know what you need and we will get you set up proper." Eleanor purchased flour, sugar, coffee, beans, salt, dried beef, ammunition for the old rifle she had found in her aunt's trunk, cloth for curtains and a new dress, needles and thread, candles, matches, soap, and a dozen other necessities. The bill was higher than she wanted it to be, eating into her small reserve of cash, but Xavier insisted she needed everything on the list and offered to vouch for her credit if necessary. The shopkeeper waved him off and told Eleanor that Martha had always paid her bills on time, and he saw no reason her niece would not do the same. While the shopkeeper was wrapping her purchases, Xavier excused himself and disappeared somewhere into the back of the town. He returned half an hour later with a young man in tow, a boy of maybe 17 with red hair and a nervous expression. "This is Danny Fletcher," Xavier said. "He is looking for work, and I told him you might need help getting the ranch running. He is a good hand with horses and cattle, and he is honest." Danny ducked his head shyly. "I do not need much pay, Miss Vance. Just meals and a place to sleep and maybe a little cash when you can spare it." Eleanor looked between the two of them, at Xavier, who had somehow known she could not run a ranch alone no matter how much help he gave her, and at this earnest boy, who probably needed work as badly as she needed help. "I have a barn you can sleep in if you do not mind sharing it with a temperamental mare," she said. "And I cannot promise fancy meals, but you will not go hungry. If that is acceptable, you are hired." Danny's face broke into a wide smile. "That is more than acceptable, madam. Thank you." They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, Danny on a borrowed horse that Xavier promised to return to the livery later. Eleanor felt lighter than she had in months, watching her supplies packed on a rented mule, knowing she had help now, knowing she was not facing everything alone anymore. That evening, after Danny had settled into the barn and Eleanor had put away her purchases, Xavier lingered at the cabin door. They had not talked about when he would come back, if he would come back, now that she had Danny to help with the heavy work. The thought of not seeing him every day made Eleanor's chest ache in a way she was not ready to examine too closely. "I should let you get some rest," Xavier said, but he did not move toward his horse. "Thank you," Eleanor said, and she meant for everything, for saving her life and fixing her pump and bringing Danny and just being there. I do not know how I can ever repay you for all you have done." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression made her breath stop. "Have dinner with me," he said quietly. "Not here, not as neighbors, at my ranch. Let me cook for you and we can sit on my porch and watch the sunset and just talk. As ourselves, not as rancher and rancher, but as Xavier and Eleanor." Her heart was beating so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Like a courting dinner, if you want to call it that. If you do not, we can call it something else. I just know that I have spent every day for 2 weeks finding excuses to come here, and it is not because I care that much about your pump handle or your fence." Eleanor felt a smile spreading across her face, genuine and warm and unstoppable. "I would like that very much." The relief that crossed his face was so obvious it made her laugh, and then he was laughing too, and the tension that had been building between them for days finally broke into something open and honest and full of hope. "Sunday," he asked. "I will come get you around noon. I will be ready." He touched his hat brim in that gesture she had come to love, then mounted his horse and rode off into the gathering dusk. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared, then went inside and leaned against the closed door with her hand pressed to her racing heart. The next 3 days passed in a blur of work and anticipation. Danny proved to be as good a hand as Xavier had promised, tackling tasks with cheerful efficiency and asking intelligent questions about what needed to be done. Together, they cleaned out the barn, reinforced the corral, and started clearing the overgrown garden plot behind the cabin. Eleanor found herself teaching Danny things she had only just learned herself, and in teaching him, she realized how much she had already absorbed about this new life. On Saturday evening, she tried on the dress she had made from the cloth purchased in Helena. It was simple, dark blue cotton with a modest neckline and long sleeves, but it fit her well and made her eyes look deeper. She had not cared about such things in months, not since before her father died, but now she found herself wanting to look nice for Xavier, wanting him to see her as something other than the dusty rancher in work-worn clothes. When Sunday morning arrived, she was too nervous to eat breakfast. She braided her hair carefully and pinned it up, then put on the new dress and her only good shoes, which were painfully impractical for ranch life, but would have to do. Danny noticed her preparations and grinned knowingly, but had the good sense not to say anything. Xavier arrived exactly at noon, riding his black stallion and leading a gentle chestnut gelding for her to ride. He had cleaned up too, she noticed, wearing a clean shirt and vest and pants without dust, his hair still damp from washing. When he saw her, his eyes widened slightly and he smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and made him look younger. "You look beautiful," he said, and there was nothing practiced or smooth about the compliment. It was just true. "Thank you," she said, feeling her cheeks warm. "You look quite nice yourself." They rode north through the August heat, following Cottonwood Creek as it wound through the grassland. Xavier pointed out landmarks, the rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, the grove of aspens where elk gathered in winter, the hill where you could see 3 mountain ranges on a clear day. Eleanor listened and watched and felt happy in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. Xavier's ranch was larger than she had expected, with a sturdy cabin, a big barn, several corrals and pastures where cattle grazed in scattered groups. The cabin was neat and well maintained, with a wide porch that faced west toward the mountains. He helped her dismount and tied both horses, then led her inside. The interior was spare but comfortable, clearly the home of a man who lived alone but took pride in his space. There was a large fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the window, and a bookshelf with several well-worn volumes. The bedroom was separated by a curtain, and there was a lean-to kitchen where she could see he had already started preparing food. "It is not fancy," he said, sounding almost apologetic. "It is wonderful," Eleanor said, and she meant it. This was a home built by hard work and determination, and it spoke of the man who lived here better than any fancy furnishings could have. He had made roasted chicken with potatoes and carrots, simple food but cooked well, and they ate at the table while afternoon light slanted through the windows. They talked about everything and nothing, about the books on his shelf and her favorite memories of her mother, and the first time he had successfully delivered a breech calf, and whether Montana really had winters as brutal as people said. After they ate, they moved to the porch with cups of coffee, sitting in chairs he had built himself from pine logs. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, and the air had finally started to cool. Eleanor could see for miles in every direction, nothing but grassland and mountains and endless sky. "I can see why you love it here," she said quietly. "It is lonely sometimes," Xavier said. "Beautiful but lonely." She looked at him and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It does not have to be," she said. He set down his coffee cup and turned in his chair to face her fully. "Eleanor, I know we have not known each other long. 3 weeks is nothing really. But I feel like I have been waiting for you without knowing it, and now that you are here, I do not want to pretend there is nothing between us. I care about you, more than I probably should given how little time has passed." Her heart was racing again, but this time it was not fear. "I care about you too. When you ride away each day, I count the hours until you come back. When you smile at me, I feel warm all over. When you are teaching me something, all I can think about is the way your hands move and the sound of your voice." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was gentle. "I want to court you properly. I want to take you to dances and church socials and all the things people do when they are getting to know each other. But I also want to be honest with you. This is a hard life. There will be years when the cattle prices drop or the weather turns bad and we lose half the herd. There will be times when we barely scrape by. I can offer you a home in my whole heart, but I cannot promise you ease or comfort." Eleanor squeezed his hand, feeling tears prick her eyes but smiling through them. "I did not come to Montana for ease or comfort. I came here because I needed to know I could survive on my own, that I could build something with my own hands. But I am learning that surviving alone and building a life alone are not the same thing. I want what you are offering, Xavier. I want the hard work and the uncertainty and the possibility of something real." He stood and pulled her gently to her feet, and then his hands were framing her face, and he was looking at her like she was the most precious thing he had ever seen. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Please," she whispered. He kissed her softly at first, a gentle brush of lips that tasted like coffee and promise. Then she leaned into him and his arms came around her, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing and hope and the beginning of forever. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heart pounding as fast as her own. "Stay," he said quietly. "Not forever yet, not until we have done this properly, but stay for dinner. Stay and watch the stars come out. Let me hold you a little longer." "Yes," she said, and they went back to the porch and sat together in one chair, her back against his chest and his arms around her waist, and watched the sun disappear behind the mountains and the first stars appear in the darkening sky. Over the next months, they fell into a pattern that felt as natural as breathing. Xavier would ride to her ranch 3 or 4 times a week, helping with the heavy work and teaching her the endless lessons of ranching. She would ride to his place on Sundays, and they would spend the day together, sometimes working side by side on his ranch, sometimes simply sitting and talking for hours. Danny proved invaluable, taking on more responsibility as he learned, and by September Eleanor's ranch was starting to look prosperous, or at least functional. In October, Xavier took her to a dance in Helena. She wore her blue dress, and he wore a suit he had purchased for the occasion, and they danced until midnight to fiddle music played by miners who were surprisingly talented. Afterward, walking through the quiet streets while they waited for their horses to be brought from the livery, he told her he loved her. She said it back without hesitation, and he kissed her under the Montana stars with the sound of distant piano music drifting from a saloon. When the first snow fell in early November, Xavier rode to her ranch through the white-covered landscape and asked her to marry him. They were standing in her barn, checking on the mare who was finally completely calm after months of patient handling, and he just turned to her and said, "Marry me, Eleanor. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night. I want to build a life together and face whatever comes knowing we are facing it as a team. Marry me." She said yes before he had finished speaking, and he lifted her up and spun her around in the dusty barn while Danny whooped with joy from the loft where he had been spreading hay. They were married in Helena 2 weeks later, in a small church with Danny as witness and the shopkeeper and his wife as guests. Eleanor wore a dress of cream-colored wool that Xavier had insisted on buying her, and he wore his suit, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed her with such tenderness that she felt tears slip down her cheeks. They spent their wedding night at a hotel in Helena, in a room with a real bed and curtains on the windows, and a view of the main street below. Xavier was gentle and patient, and Eleanor discovered that being with him was everything she had hoped and more, a joining not just of bodies but of hearts and futures and dreams. In the morning, they rode back to Xavier's ranch, which was now Eleanor's ranch too. Her own place at Cottonwood Creek would continue to operate with Danny managing it for a share of the profits. But her home was with Xavier now, in the cabin with the wide porch and the view of the mountains. Winter came in hard, with storms that buried the landscape in snow and temperatures that dropped so low the water froze in the trough even at midday. But Eleanor had prepared under Xavier's guidance, and they had food stored and wood stacked, and the cattle moved to sheltered valleys. On the coldest nights, they would sit by the fire while Xavier read aloud from his small collection of books, and Eleanor worked on sewing projects, making curtains for the cabin and shirts for her husband, and gradually transforming the bare interior into a home that reflected both of them. In the spring, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. Xavier was so overjoyed he immediately wanted to ride to every neighboring ranch to share the news, and she had to talk him into waiting at least until she was further along. They spent the summer preparing, building a cradle from pine wood, and adding a small room onto the cabin for the baby. Danny came by often with updates on how the Cottonwood Creek Ranch was doing, and he always brought small gifts, a toy he had whittled or a blanket one of the neighbor women had made when she heard about the expected baby. In October, on a day when the aspens were turning gold and the air had the first real bite of autumn, Eleanor gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, attended by a midwife from Helena and Xavier, who refused to leave her side despite the midwife's suggestion that he wait outside. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Xavier held him with shaking hands and tears streaming down his face. "What should we name him?" Eleanor asked, exhausted but glowing. Xavier looked down at the baby, then at her, and his smile was radiant. "Thomas," he said. After Tom Carlyle, The man who taught me that helping others is what makes us human. Thomas Nolan, Eleanor said, testing the name. It is perfect. They fell into the chaos of new parenthood, learning together how to soothe a crying baby and change diapers and function on almost no sleep. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Thomas in the middle of the night, singing to him in his rough voice, gazing at him with an expression of such profound love that it made Eleanor fall in love with her husband all over again. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and work and slow growth. Eleanor learned to ride like she had been born in the saddle, to rope cattle and doctor sick animals, and read weather signs in the sky. Xavier expanded the ranch, buying more land and building a bigger herd. Danny eventually saved enough to purchase his own small spread adjacent to Eleanor's original ranch, and they all helped him build a cabin and get started. When Thomas was 3, Eleanor gave birth to twin girls, Hannah and Grace, who came into the world so fast the midwife barely arrived in time. They were fierce from birth, loud and demanding and full of energy, and Xavier doted on them shamelessly. Thomas became the protective older brother, watching over his sisters with serious determination. 2 years after the twins, Eleanor had another son, William, who was quiet and thoughtful from the start, content to sit and watch the world around him with wide, curious eyes. And 3 years after that came the last baby, another daughter named Martha after Eleanor's aunt, who proved to have inherited her namesake's stubborn independence. The cabin had to be expanded several times to accommodate the growing family, until it was no longer recognizable as the simple structure Xavier had built years ago. There was a parlor now, and a proper kitchen, and 4 bedrooms and a porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the building. The ranch itself had grown too, one of the largest in the territory, employing several hands and running hundreds of head of cattle. But despite the success and the growth, Xavier and Eleanor never forgot where they had started. Every year on the anniversary of the day the horse had bolted, and he had ridden alongside to stop it, they would ride together to Cottonwood Creek and sit by the water and remember. They would talk about how terrified Eleanor had been, how she had thought she was going to die on that lonely road, and how Xavier had appeared like Providence itself and saved her life without knowing he was also saving her heart. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had not been on that road that day?" Xavier asked one year as they sat watching the creek flow past. Eleanor leaned against him, comfortable and safe after 15 years of marriage. "I try not to. I like to think we would have found each other somehow. The universe would have brought us together." "The universe and a runaway horse," Xavier said with a smile. "The best runaway horse that ever lived," Eleanor agreed. As they aged, they watched their children grow and start their own lives. Thomas took over the main ranch operation, proving to have his father's gift with cattle and his mother's head for business. The twins both married, Hannah to a rancher from the next county over, and Grace to a schoolteacher who had moved to Helena from back east. William became a veterinarian, studying in Chicago but returning to Montana to set up his practice. And little Martha, stubborn to the end, married a lawyer and moved to Butte, where she became involved in the suffrage movement and wrote passionate letters home about women's rights. Xavier's hair turned silver, and Eleanor's face gained lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the sun and smiling at her family. But they were still strong, still capable of a full day's work, still in love with each other and the life they had built. One evening in their 60th year, long after the children had all left home, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, just as they had done on their first courting dinner so many decades ago. The view had not changed, still mountains and grassland and endless sky, but everything else had. "You ever regret it?" Xavier asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going back to the city, choosing this hard life." Eleanor took his hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "Not for a single moment. This life gave me you and our children and the knowledge that I am stronger than I ever thought possible. How could I regret that? I was so scared that day I saw you on that runaway horse," Xavier admitted. "I was riding from Tom's place, heading to Helena, and I almost did not take that road. Almost went the long way around. If I had, I never would have met you. But you did take that road. You saved me that day, and you have been saving me in one way or another ever since." "You saved me too," Xavier said, turning to look at her with eyes that were still the same winter smoke gray she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "I was just existing before you came, working and surviving but not really living. You taught me what it means to have a home instead of just a house, to have a family instead of just being alone. You gave me everything." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and when they pulled apart she said, "We gave it to each other." They sat together as the stars came out, holding hands and remembering, two people who had found each other by accident and built a forever through choice. The Montana night wrapped around them, vast and dark and full of the sounds of the land they loved. And Eleanor thought that if she could go back and tell her younger self, that terrified woman on the runaway horse, that everything was going to turn out better than she could possibly imagine, she would not have believed it. But it was true. All of it was gloriously, impossibly true. Xavier lived to be 83, still working the ranch until a month before he died, still holding Eleanor's hand every night as they fell asleep. When he passed away peacefully in their bed one spring morning, Eleanor grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 45 years together, which was more than many people got, and they had filled every one of those years with love and work and purpose. Eleanor lived another 7 years after Xavier's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom had inherited pieces of her and Xavier in their faces, and their stubborn determination, and their love of the land. She never left the ranch, never wanted to be anywhere except the place where she and Xavier had built their life together. On a warm summer evening in her 90th year, she died in her sleep in the room where all her children had been born, in the bed she had shared with Xavier for 4.5 decades. Her family buried her next to him on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains they had both loved, and on the shared gravestone, they carved both their names and a simple inscription: "Together from the moment she could not hold the reins." The ranch continued for generations after them, passed down through their children and their children's children, and everyone who worked that land knew the story of how it all began, with a runaway horse and a cowboy brave enough to ride alongside, and two people who found in each other exactly what they had been searching for without knowing they were searching at all. It became part of the family legend, told around dinner tables and at weddings, a reminder that sometimes the scariest moments in our lives are actually the beginning of everything good that follows, and that love, real love, is worth whatever hard work it takes to build and maintain and protect. And on summer evenings, when the light turned golden across the grassland, and the air smelled of sage and wildflowers, sometimes the ranch hands would swear they could see two figures riding together in the distance, side by side, heading home.